I was looking at a map of the East with a colleague recently, and he dismissively pointed to that crescent-shaped string of islands, calling it small Japan. It's a common sentiment, the idea of a tiny, resource-poor nation clinging to the edge of a massive continent. But then I showed him the data. That small island nation actually mirrors the landmass of Germany and dwarfs the United Kingdom. Its coastline nearly rivals that of China, yet it faces the open fury of the Pacific alone. There is a strained, almost eerie luck to its position. Twice the Mongol Empire, the most terrifying military force in human history, launched massive armadas to crush these islands. And twice the ocean itself seemed to intervene, conjuring storms that wiped the invaders from the face of the earth before they could even draw their swords. This wasn't just a weather event, it was the birth of a geological lottery winner. But the real mystery isn't just how Japan survived, but how it transformed. While its giant neighbor across the sea was trapped in a cycle of bloody revolutions and mandates of heaven that broke every few centuries, Japan did something almost impossible. It transitioned from a secluded, feudal backwater to a global industrial powerhouse with a smoothness that defies traditional history. It makes you wonder, was Japan's rise a fluke of geography, or was there something hidden in their culture? A strange, small Europe logic that allowed them to bridge the gap between ancient ritual and modern capitalism while everyone else was sinking. We often think of the emperor and the samurai as relics of the past, but what if they were actually the secret engines of the future? To understand why Japan succeeded where other empires crumbled, we have to look past the small label and see the hidden superpower that was waiting for its sunrise. And that really is the mission for this deep dive. To stop debating labels like small Japan and instead examine the specific historical and cultural infrastructure that let Japan make that leap. We're looking for a kind of strategic blueprint for success, a set of crucial preconditions that enabled that incredible speed, like a hidden operating system.
And if we're going to find that blueprint, we absolutely have to start in a place that most standard histories just tend to rush past. And that's the long, quiet era of the Tokugawa period. We're talking from 1603 all the way up to 1868.
Right, the period of isolation. It's so easy to just write it off as backward or stagnant.
It is, but that's a huge mistake analytically. We need to see that 250-year span not as a vacuum, but as the critical preparatory phase. This isolation, this turning inward, it actually built three non-negotiable foundations for what came later. First, it centralized administration. Second, it developed a genuinely national economy. And third, and this is probably the most crucial part, it fostered mass literacy.
So the argument is that this long period of peace and seclusion wasn't stagnation at all. It was internal consolidation.
Precisely.
Without the Tokugawa era integrating the state internally, the Meiji Restoration wouldn't have been a stable pivot. It would have just been chaos.
Absolute destabilizing chaos.
Yeah.
It was this period of sustained peace that paradoxically created the very infrastructure needed for rapid modernization, all while it was actively trying to keep the modern world out.
It sounds like a contradiction in terms.
It is. Think of it as centralized feudalism. I know that sounds like a conceptual contradiction, but it really defined the state. I mean, yes, technically it was a feudal system. You had various territorial lords, the daimyo. But the shogunate, the Tokugawa government, it operated much more like a federal or national authority.
So the Tokugawa clan was just the biggest and most powerful of all the lords.
By far. They were the wealthiest, and they had these mechanisms of control like the Senkin Kutai system, the alternate attendance system.
Ah, right, where they forced all the other lords to spend time in the capital.
Exactly. This system effectively controlled all the other lords, ensuring political unity under a single overarching administrative umbrella. It was a really clever piece of political engineering.
And the political center, Edo, which of course becomes Tokyo, must have been central to that whole control mechanism.
Absolutely central. The rule was that every lord had to maintain a massive household in Edo and spend half their time there. Their families were often kept there as, well, hostages, essentially.
So it was a constant drain on their resources.
A huge drain. And what that meant was that wealth, people, and influence were just continually flowing toward the center. So Edo was the political capital, sure, but this enforced structure also made it the single greatest consumption center in the entire nation.
It created a giant non-stop market.
A ravenous market. A huge demand for goods, luxury items, food, textiles, all of which had to be supplied from the provinces.
Okay, so if Edo was the consumer, the big mouth that had to be fed, which city became the engine of distribution? Where did all this stuff flow through?
That role fell to Osaka. It evolved into the undisputed mercantile and financial capital of Japan. It was the central port city for rice. And you have to remember, rice was basically the currency of the era.
So it was like the Fort Knox of rice?
In a way, yeah. But it was also the main hub for everything else. Textiles, say, timber, all the commodities. And this is probably the most overlooked precondition we're talking about today. Long before Commodore Perry's ships ever appeared, Japan already had a sophisticated nationwide market for commodities, for capital, and for credit.
You had big financial houses already.
Oh yeah, this is where you see the first appearance of influential houses like Sumitomo and Mitsui. They were creating financial institutions, things like rice futures exchanges, really sophisticated credit networks.
So when Japan finally opened up, the economic circulatory system was already in place.
The veins and arteries were all there, ready to be connected to the global economy. They weren't starting from zero.
That economic integration is clear, but let's talk about the backbone of that system, the samurai. We have this, romanticized image of the lone warrior with his sword.
Kurosawa movies.
Exactly. But this long piece must have fundamentally changed what it meant to be a samurai. If there were no wars to fight, what did a samurai actually do all day?
Well, they traded their swords for spreadsheets, their battlefield duties for, bureaucratic discipline.
So they became administrators.
That's it, exactly. The romanticized warrior role was largely obsolete. During this 250-year span of peace, most samurai served as administrators, clerks, accountants, judges.
So they were basically hereditary, salaried government officials.
That's the perfect description. They were almost entirely separated from farming or any kind of direct productive labor. They were paid in rice stipends by their local domain or the shogunate.
That's such a powerful image. An entire warrior elite transformed into a disciplined, nationwide class of administrators. But that requires a specific skill set, right? It's not just about being good with a sword.
Not at all. It required a standardized education.
Where did they get that?
They got it through rigorous, Confucian-based schooling that was provided by their own domains. The goal wasn't just classical education. It was about training highly effective civil servants who could run complex systems. Their daily tasks were things like managing local tax collection, arbitrating civil disputes, keeping meticulous public records, and making sure the shogunate's legal codes were enforced uniformly.
So they were learning logistics and management on the job for generations.
For over 2 centuries, yeah. They developed an unparalleled capacity for complex systems management simply because it was their hereditary job.
So the Tokugawa stability accidentally trained the entire government administration that you would need for a 19th century industrial state.
Got it.
When the Meiji government decided to modernize, they didn't have to train thousands of civil servants from scratch. They just repurposed the existing samurai bureaucracy.
They repurposed the whole talent pool.
And that brings us to what I believe was the single most critical, uniquely Japanese precondition. The thing that truly separated them from China or Korea or even most of Europe at the time. And what was that?
The considerable growth of literacy among the common people. Not just the samurai. We're talking non-samurai townspeople and villagers.
We hear about Japan's high literacy rates a lot, but what was driving it? In the West, it was often tied to religion, like Protestantism. Was it the same in Japan?
No, the driver was primarily commercial and administrative necessity, not religious doctrine. The complexity of that integrated national economy we just talked about, it required it. Merchants needed to be able to read contracts, track accounts, manage these complex distribution networks.
And the government needed people to be able to read its decrees.
Exactly. The government and the domains needed a literate populace to understand and comply with edicts, with taxation notices, with legal rulings.
So the economic machine itself was demanding an educated population. Where did they get this education?
It was fostered through these amazing local education systems, mainly the Terracotta. These were basically private elementary schools. And because of them, by the end of the Tokugawa era, estimates suggest that the male literacy rate might have been as high as 40 to 50%. Female literacy was lower, maybe 15 to 20%, but even those levels were often higher than contemporary countries in Europe.
That is astonishing.
It's a game changer, because when Western technology and economic concepts finally arrived, Japan had an intellectual foundation that was capable of receiving that information, translating it, and applying it right across the social spectrum.
They didn't have to wait decades to build a school system first.
They had an immediate capacity to adapt. That's what really accelerated the Meiji pivot and separated them from so many other nations that were facing Western encroachment.
That's a phenomenal foundation to build on. An integrated market, a trained administration, a literate populace. But as we established, that peace couldn't last forever. The outside world was coming.
It couldn't. And the geopolitical shock was severe, but it was also anticipated, at least by the intellectual class.
They saw it coming.
Oh, yes. The realization that their isolationist policy was a huge geopolitical liability, that started right after China's crushing defeat in the First Opium War, back in 1842.
So they were looking across the water at what was happening to their massive neighbor and thinking, we're next.
They were seeing a terrifying and what they saw as an inevitable forecast of their own future. If the massive Chinese mainland couldn't resist the West, what chance did an island nation have?
And that forecast arrived right on schedule.
It did. 1853. Commodore Perry's black gunboats steam into Tokyo Bay, demanding that Japan open up for trade. That technological and military shock immediately precipitated the collapse of the Tokugawa regime. He was just exposed as being totally unable to defend the nation. And that leads directly to the Meiji Restoration in 1868.
The Meiji Revolution always sounds like a complete societal reboot. I mean, dismantling centuries of tradition in just a few decades. How do they pull that off with any kind of stability? Why didn't it just dissolve into the kind of constant civil wars that plagued other rapidly modernizing nations?
The stability comes directly from those Tokugawa foundations we've been talking about. The leaders of the Restoration, who were drawn largely from powerful domains that were historically anti-Tokugawa, like Chushu and Satsuma, they were highly educated and they were deeply pragmatic.
They weren't starting from a blank slate.
Not at all. They immediately abolished the feudal domains, allowing for the free movement of people, goods, and money. They replaced the old domain-based systems with modern prefectures, and they looked abroad for models. They adopted modern legal and political statutes, created a constitution and a parliament based mainly on continental European systems.
Specifically German models, right? The Prussian system was a big influence.
A huge influence, especially for the constitution. They saw Prussia as another state that had modernized rapidly from a position of relative weakness to become a major power. It seemed like a good fit. So the feudal wall came crashing down, but that administrative spine, the samurai bureaucracy, it remained intact and functional.
That pivot from isolation to an open mastery of the sea is just fascinating. For centuries, the sea was their great protector, their defensive wall, and now, all of a sudden, it had to become their bridge to the world.
That analogy of converting the maritime wall into a bridge is perfect. It perfectly captures the strategic mindset change. They recognized that isolation was no longer viable. So the new Meiji government made infrastructure development an immediate national security imperative.
What were the first steps?
They moved incredibly fast. They developed a modern, standardized monetary system. They built telegraphs. And they established major railway networks, most notably the Chikaido line.
Which was critical for connecting the main economic centers.
Absolutely. It connected the economic powerhouses of Kobe and Osaka with the new political capital, Tokyo. They were consciously building the logistical circulatory system of a modern maritime trading power.
We often have this image of the Meiji government as this all-powerful, top-down entity that just directed every single facet of industrialization, almost like a command economy. How accurate is that picture? Was that really the mechanism they used?
That view is significantly exaggerated, and it's a really crucial point to understand the blueprint. While the government played an undisputed central role in stimulating modernization, its financial resources were actually highly limited.
Really? I would have assumed they had massive state coffers.
Not at all. In the 19th century, government expenditure as a percentage of GDP hovered around only 10%. They simply lacked the capital to carry out the rapid, complete industrialization of Japan all on their own.
So what happened when they did try that top-down command approach?
Well, in the very earliest days, they did try it. The Meiji government tried to run its own model factories and strategic enterprises. They were called Kanshoku Kuju.
In which sectors?
The key ones: mining, shipyards, silk, cotton spinning, cement. They wanted to lead by example, but most of these attempts were outright failures.
Why did they fail?
The government bureaucrats, however disciplined they were as administrators, they just lacked business acumen. They didn't have marketing skills. They didn't have the necessary entrepreneurial flexibility.
So bureaucratic rigidity met market reality.
Exactly. And they often relied on outdated foreign technology, or they just failed to adapt to changing market demands. This led to a critical and often overlooked policy diversion in 1881. It's often referred to as the Matsukata deflation, and it included a fundamental shift toward laissez-faire economics.
So the government just admitted it couldn't do it.
In essence, yes. They recognized their limitations. They stopped trying to run the factories themselves and shifted to empowering private enterprise. They often sold off these failed model factories to private interests.
At a discount, I assume.
Usually at very steep discounts.
So this sounds less like a failure and more like a brilliant piece of state-supported private development. By selling these government-built failures, they were essentially seeding the first great Japanese conglomerates, the zaibatsu.
That's precisely what happened. They privatized the risk and the labor of entrepreneurial management. Instead of trying to run everything, the government focused its efforts where it really excelled, building that essential social infrastructure, the railways, ports, telegraphs, the modern banking and monetary system.
And they must have kept a hand in some strategic areas.
They did. They retained strategic support for international service firms. These firms, especially the ones dealing with foreign trade and shipping, were absolutely vital because Japan had zero experience in modern international business after the long Tokugawa isolation.
The shipping and shipbuilding industry seems like the perfect intersection of commerce and national security, where that retained government support would be critical, especially in such a cutthroat global environment.
Absolutely. The policymakers were incredibly astute. They were keenly aware of international competition. They were getting reports from their consuls abroad detailing these massive shipping subsidies being awarded by European powers, France, Britain, Italy, Austria. They quickly realized that pure free market competition was a fiction.
So if they wanted a merchant marine, they had to pay for it.
They realized that if Japan was going to succeed as a maritime nation, some level of support was necessary just to overcome the international state-backed competition.
So their decision to subsidize wasn't about favoring private wealth. It was a targeted strategic investment in national capability.
Correct. For instance, in 1893, they reformed their subsidy approach. They didn't just throw money at all shipping. They made a very conscious strategic choice to prioritize supporting the overseas lines, specifically the Australian and European routes. And they postponed domestic subsidies.
They were investing in the bridge.
They were investing heavily in the bridge, their capacity to project trade and power globally. This focus on maritime projection was a foundational strategic choice. And then the successful outcome of the Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95, which was a surprise to many, secured their first major overseas territorial gains and a huge indemnity payment. That really cemented their trajectory as an aspiring imperial and industrial power. It's incredible how that 19th century pivot from a feudal island to a maritime powerhouse still feels like it defines Japan's strategic blueprint today. Let's fast forward to the present, because this historical context gives us a really clear lens to view Japan's modern strategy in the Indo-Pacific. The core challenge seems to be the same. How do you balance global trade integration with national security in a really contested environment? The parallels are stark, yes. Right now, we're seeing this accelerated geopolitical restructuring of global supply chains, especially post-2025. This means a move away from pure economic efficiency, wherever something is cheapest, and toward resilience and alliance-driven production. The term you hear a lot is friendshoring.
And the U.S. is leading that charge.
Very much so. The United States is redefining core industries, semiconductors, rare earths, steel, pharmaceuticals, as national security assets. They're conditioning industrial cooperation on security alignment.
And Japan is actively positioning itself not just as a participant in that, but as a potential institutional designer within these new alliance-driven production architectures.
It's the mature stage of converting that defensive wall into a strategic bridge. It's security through economic integration.
Let's look at a concrete example, rare earths.
Okay, take the rare earth case. China's tightening control over critical minerals is a massive vulnerability for any modern industrial power. Japan is responding with this multi-layered resilience strategy. It includes developing deep-sea resources in its own economic zone, investing in technology to find substitutes for rare earths, and, crucially, institutionalizing cooperation with trusted partners.
So joint resource strategies with the EU and the US.
Exactly. They're literally building redundant backup systems against a potential supply shock from China.
And we saw a very specific, high-profile example of this kind of integration just recently in the steel sector.
Nippon Steel's acquisition of U.S. Steel. It's a landmark case in this new era of alliance-based industrial reconstruction. It highlights Japan's willingness to use political accommodation, things like golden share arrangements or commitments to maintain U.S. labor standards to secure strategic access.
So it's not just about buying a company.
Not at all. It's about integrating production capacity directly into an allied nation's defense and industrial base. It's institutionalizing security through shared ownership.
And going back to maritime power, which is Japan's historical sweet spot,
Yeah.
What are the modern concerns there, especially with China's military-civil fusion doctrine?
Well, Washington's focus on maritime rearmament and the rise of military-civil fusion in China, where civilian industrial capacity is just seamlessly integrated into military logistics, that has forced Japan to seriously reconsider its own industrial capacity in shipbuilding.
So it's not enough to just order more ships.
Right. It requires policy action beyond just placing orders. It's about harmonizing standards with partners like the U.S. and South Korea and addressing internal challenges like labor shortages. It's all about ensuring their industrial base remains functional and aligned with security needs in a high-tension region.
You also mentioned pharmaceuticals. What does medical supply sovereignty mean in practical terms for someone listening to this?
It means ensuring that Japan can't be held hostage in a public health crisis by foreign supply chains. Think of it this way. Almost every pill, from a simple antibiotic to a specialized cancer drug, is made from an active pharmaceutical ingredient, an API.
The core chemical compound.
The core chemical. Now, if you're making the finished pill in Tokyo, but the API comes entirely from one producer in another country, you have a massive strategic vulnerability. Medical sovereignty means Japan is actively working to onshore that API production, bringing the manufacturing of those core chemicals back home, or at least securing the supply through trusted treaty allies like the US and the EU.
So it's the same logic as rare earths or steel?
It's the exact same logic. They're investing heavily in regulatory reforms and trilateral cooperation to guarantee reliability, turning pharmaceuticals into a national security asset.
It's truly remarkable. The nation that historically struggled to run its own model factories is now functioning as a high-level strategic architect, designing resilient supply chains across the entire Indo-Pacific. But that structural framework, the history, and the hard strategy, that's only half the story. We promised we'd look past the political structure and ask about the hidden cultural engine. What internal mechanics sustained this growth and created these extraordinarily long-lived corporations?
This brings us to a really fascinating and often misunderstood intersection. The one between the warrior code Bushido and the merchant code, which is called Shunindo, the way of the merchant. You really cannot understand Japan's corporate longevity without understanding the relationship and the tension between these two ethical systems.
And historically, the samurai looked down on the merchants, right?
Virulently. During the Tokugawa era, samurai texts were often incredibly critical and even disdainful of merchants.
Why the intense moral disdain? Was it just jealousy because merchants were getting rich while samurai stipends were fixed?
That was the financial engine of the disdain, absolutely. The long peace meant a samurai's income was a fixed payment, a fixed emolument. So they saw their wealth decline relative to the rising wealth of the townspeople, especially the merchants.
So from their perspective, the merchants were unethical.
They saw them as unethical because they skimmed off the margins and sought profit, which were activities viewed as inherently impure compared to the honest labor of a farmer or the direct service of a warrior. Some Confucian scholars, like Oju Sorai, even suggested merchants were socially akin to thieves because their wealth came from manipulating distribution, not producing actual value.
But despite all this high-level moral criticism, we know that Shunindo existed. There was a rigorous ethical code that governed how merchants behaved. It wasn't just unprincipled greed.
Not at all. And if you compare the virtues that were shared by both codes, you find this massive overlap: filial piety, honesty, benevolence, and especially frugality. These were universal virtues required of all four classes of Edo society.
So where did they diverge? What was the core difference?
The divergence was in their core intrinsic purpose, their reason for being.
Okay, so what was the intrinsic distinction between the warrior's path and the merchant's path? What was the one non-negotiable principle for each?
For Bushido, the core intrinsic principle was bravery, the willingness to face death and die with honor for one's master. For the merchant's ethics, for Shonindo, the priority was trust and the absolute necessity of preserving that trust. For the merchant, the entire ethical structure centered on gaining and maintaining credibility. Because this intangible wealth confidence, or shenyu, it was their most valuable property, far more valuable than cash or inventory.
That makes perfect business sense. I mean, if a samurai loses his life, he gains honor. But if a merchant loses his credibility, he loses everything.
He's finished.
His suppliers won't sell to him, his customers won't buy from him. Game over.
Exactly. The focus is continuity. And that intrinsic focus on longevity and trust became the perfect mechanism for corporate stability. This defines the Chinese model, those centuries-old family businesses that Japan is so famous for.
And it stands in such stark contrast to the Western capital model, which so often prioritizes aggressive, disruptive, short-term expansion.
A completely different mindset.
So the ultimate goal of Shinindo was often framed as a contribution to society. How did they rationalize profit within that nodal goal? It seems contradictory.
They reframed profit. It wasn't seen as selfish acquisition, but as remuneration for an essential social service.
What service?
The key concept was distribution. Profit was seen as payment for the essential function of moving goods from regions where there was a surplus to regions where there was a need, thus compensating for deficiencies elsewhere. They even compared this remuneration explicitly to a samurai's fixed stipend. It was natural for the merchant to profit, but that profit had to derive from fair business and service to the common good.
That puts a huge ethical guardrail on your activities. If profit is just a kind of fixed service fee, a form of compensation, and not the goal itself, that changes the entire business philosophy.
It does.
Greed in that model becomes immediately self-destructive.
Absolutely. Merchants who were seen as greedy, who hoarded goods during shortages or sought bloated instant profits, they were typically ruined within a single generation because they violated that core principle of trust. And that ties directly back to the most paramount virtue you see in mercantile texts: frugality, or shimatsu.
That was the #1 virtue.
It was the most frequently cited virtue, and it was considered the capital for becoming wealthy and the basis for management.
Was this frugality just another word for being stingy? How did they distinguish between necessary saving and just being narrow-minded?
A critical distinction, and one they taught very carefully. Frugality meant avoiding extravagance, ostentation, waste. It meant living simply, avoiding unnecessary spending on clothing, housing, or entertainment. However, and this is the key, they stressed that true frugality spares no money for necessary expenses or for helping others, particularly one's employees or community in times of need.
Can you give me an example of the difference in practice?
Sure. Imagine two textile merchants. Let's call the first one Mr. Stingy. He refuses to buy quality dye for his cloth because it costs too much. The result is a poor product that customers reject. He also refuses to repair a leak in his warehouse roof, which eventually ruins a whole shipment of valuable silk. He's miserly and he loses his wealth.
Okay.
Now the second merchant, Mr. Frugal. He uses only the highest quality necessary materials. He lives in a modest home. He serves simple meals. But he meticulously invests in his infrastructure. He maintains modest profit margins to keep customers loyal, and he makes sure his employees are treated well, even during lean times.
Mr. Frugal accumulates generational wealth and trust. Mr. Stingy is ruined by his own short-sightedness.
That's it. Stinginess was seen as narrow-minded and ultimately self-interested. Frugality was a strategic, long-term capital preservation method.
So the long-term view meant prioritizing customer satisfaction and managing expectations over a quick buck.
Correct. Great merchants avoided deception, they kept profit margins modest and reasonable to ensure steady business, and they knew that customers would gather where goods were affordable and reliable. They prioritized the intangible wealth of confidence and trust over quick returns, understanding that a self-interested person would ultimately fail to build a Chinese.
This deeply ethical philosophy must have translated directly into their unique approach to managing their labor force and their whole corporate structure.
It did. And it defined the structure of the Japanese corporation for over a century. The entire enterprise was treated not merely as a business entity, but as a collective household, or IE. And that view leads directly to the core management practices that characterize Japanese business history. Systems like familistic management, lifetime employment, and promotion by seniority.
And a different decision-making process, too.
Yes, the structure favored consultation systems in decision-making, where input from various levels was sought. It reflected the deep cultural need for workplace harmony and institutional stability over individual speed or brilliance.
I remember reading about the head of a Chinese confectionery shop who viewed her employees not as human resources, but as part of that collective household. It was rooted in a modernized Bushido ethic, service, and discipline, but applied to commerce.
Right.
That rejection of the short-term Western exit strategy in favor of loyalty and social harmony makes perfect sense in this context.
It is the structural relationship. The collective institutional stability is prioritized absolutely over aggressive short-term capital expansion, which might destabilize the household. And the continuity of the institution and its ethics was reinforced from the bottom up by that unique education system we mentioned earlier, the Terracotta.
Tell me a bit more about the practical application of that education. What were they learning?
Well, the Terracotta were these private elementary schools for commoners, and they were often run in a spirit of volunteerism and local engagement. And this highly effective system ensured continuity by instilling Confucian, Buddhist, and Shinto virtues right alongside the basic skills like reading, writing, and the abacus. So children, typically from ages 7 to 15, they received this really effective moral education that focused intensely on honesty, diligence, and filial piety.
So long before they ever entered a Chinese as an apprentice or a factory after the Meiji Restoration, they were already preloaded with the ethical firmware they'd need to be a disciplined, literate, long-term focused workforce.
Precisely. This continuity, reinforced by moral education and that household mentality, it ensured a culturally consistent and highly adaptable workforce that was capable of handling the demands of rapid modernization. This is so often the overlooked factor in Japan's success. The moral infrastructure was already in place, and that made the transition intellectually and logistically smoother than anyone could have expected.
Okay, we've established how brilliant and efficient this whole system was. From the administrative centralization to the ethical training, all of it designed for collective longevity. But creating a hyper-efficient machine always comes at a cost, especially when you think about the demands placed on the individual. Let's talk about the sociological trade-offs of this rapid, top-down modernization.
It's absolutely essential to address the human cost. The Meiji-era centralization and the emperor system model that followed, they were brilliant political and military strategies for rapid industrialization and geopolitical maneuvering, no question. But designing a brilliantly efficient collective machine inevitably imposes massive, often crushing pressure on the individual cogs that are operating inside it.
And nowhere is that pressure cooker environment more evident than in the result of that hyper-centralization. The modern, hyper-urbanized Tokyo metropolitan area, a place where individual identity can feel utterly dissolved into the collective function.
That's where the sociological fallout is most visible, I think. The intense concentration of activity, the relentless efficiency, the demand for conformity. It can lead to what sociologists call crowded loneliness.
A feeling of being surrounded by millions of people while all your interactions are just transactional.
Overwhelmingly transactional, impersonal, and lacking any deep community connection, yes.
I think of the young professionals you hear about living in places like Shinjuku, sharing that exact experience. The system demands total, lifelong loyalty to the corporate household, but that loyalty often translates into an immense workload and the deferral of personal life, of family formation.
That is the direct consequence of the longevity model. The structure that's designed for corporate stability, lifetime employment, promotion by seniority, it's brilliant for the collecting institution. But it forces the individual, particularly the male corporate warrior, into a life that's defined by intense discipline and extremely long working hours. And this intensity just exacerbates social alienation and creates these profound conflicts around traditional social expectations.
Like the classic conflict around the good wife, wise mother archetype.
Yeah.
That ideal is colliding with the reality that women are now absolutely necessary in the corporate workplace, or just the immense dual workload demanded of them in a society where the male partner is so often absent due to work.
Exactly. The individual, both male and female, is caught between the expectations of a pre-modern collective ethic, that lifelong dedication to the household, and the crushing demands of a modern capitalist machine that optimizes for efficiency above all else. The rapid success was achieved by prioritizing the collective machine's function, often at the direct expense of individual fulfillment, personal balance, or just the time required to nurture a family life.
It's the ultimate paradox, isn't it? The very system that was designed for continuity and economic longevity creates a human cost alienation, social pressure, stress that ultimately threatens the society's ability to perpetuate itself. I mean, you can draw a straight line to the demographic crisis.
You can. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the demographic crisis, the declining birth rate, the alienation, that is the high human price tag for this extreme collective efficiency. While collective efficiency was maximized, the individual's capacity for personal relational fulfillment risks being undernurtured. The machine runs brilliantly, but its parts are struggling to reproduce.
It's a sobering thought, especially when we consider the universality of those ethical foundations we talked about. We noted that the core virtues prized by successful Japanese merchants, frugality, sincerity, industry, are pretty much the same virtues Benjamin Franklin was writing about in the West. So was Japan simply more disciplined in applying these universal human values?
I believe the difference lies in the application and the structural enforcement. The core virtues were human, yes, but their application in Japan was uniquely disciplined, profoundly long-term, and it was backed by that pre-existing social and administrative structure. The Tokugawa era's centralized literate bureaucracy allowed them to make that transition without descending into chaos. They leveraged a pre-modern military code, Bushido, and successfully fused it with a highly disciplined merchant code, Shinindo, to create this entirely unique model of industrial organization built on loyalty and longevity.
And we can't forget that initial geopolitical safety net, the thing that gave them the breathing room to build that structure in the first place.
No, you can't. The strategic triumph of Meiji relied heavily on that geological lottery winner status. The island geography provided a crucial buffer. It minimized the need for expensive, ruinous continental land warfare, the kind of high-cost conflict that just drained mainland empires like China. And it allowed the resources they had accumulated during the Tokugawa period to be focused almost entirely on maritime trade and internal development during that critical modernization phase.
The island status gave them the security they needed to build the machine before they had to fully engage with the continental powers.
That's it. It gave them time.
So to try and synthesize this whole deep dive, Japan's improbable transformation wasn't a fluke, and it wasn't just one thing. It was this powerful combination. First, the geopolitical luck of their island position, which provided a safety net. Second, the long administrative and social readiness that the Tokugawa era gave them, specifically that highly literate society and the repurposed samurai bureaucracy. That gave them the organizational talent for a lightning-fast transformation.
And third, the hidden cultural engine. A distinct, internalized ethical code, Shonindo, which rigorously prioritized continuity, trust, and modest profit over disruption and short-term gain. This cultural DNA allowed the nation to successfully bridge that gap between ancient ritual and modern industrialism with a stability that was, and still is, remarkable. It created a powerful strategic blueprint for its future global engagement. But Japan also provides a really stark illustration. It shows that the strategic triumph of creating a brilliantly efficient, centralized modern state comes with profound internal costs. While that collective household model secures economic longevity and national security integration on the global stage, it's intense pressure on the individual, the pressure leading to alienation and demographic strain. It forces us all to consider where the true sustainability of a society ultimately resides.